started. Excellent. Okay, welcome everybody to another Women in THR webinar. And today we are joined again by Michelle Minton, who is a policy analyst at the Reason Foundation, which is a non-profit American libertarian think tank that was founded in 1978. And it publishes an online magazine called the Reason Magazine. And thank you very much for joining us again, Michelle. So Michelle was actually with us in July for the first time on a webinar, and we'll link that below so you can watch that episode. I highly recommend it. And in that video, Michelle introduced her background, her career history, and also talked about the important research that she has done on the benefits of nicotine. And so this year, Michelle attended the Global Forum on Nicotine conference in Warsaw in Poland and delivered a very interesting presentation called Nicotine, Pleasure and Transgressive Wellness, where she talked about the traditional medical use of tobacco throughout the world to treat a variety of diseases. And we'll link that below. So I highly recommend you see that presentation by Michelle. My name is Jess Perkins, and I'm joined by my colleague Ilna today. And we represent a platform called tobaccoharmreduction.net, and it's this platform who's hosting the webinar today. So in aid of National Mental Health Day, which was the 10th of October, we wanted to speak to Michelle specifically about the benefits of nicotine and smoking cessation products on people's mental health. So it's a very interesting topic. And it's very topical at this time of year with suicide prevention and awareness month in September, with World Mental Health Day in October. So I think it's a great time to talk to you, Michelle, about mental health. So the first question is, so we can start talking about nicotine, which is a relatively low risk drug. What research, Michelle, do you know of that has been done that shows there could be a positive effect of nicotine on the brain? And could there be any negative effects?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of research on nicotine, obviously, not so much looking particularly at the benefits. That's pretty scattered throughout the decades. But there is, collectively over many decades, a lot of really interesting early research showing certain benefits on mental, cognitive abilities, on mood, on particular dysfunctions, that kind of stuff. And I know we're going to talk about Dr. Newhouse's mind study later in this webinar. And thank you for having me on again, by the way, for that. So what nicotine seems to do is a bunch of things. Obviously, it's a really fascinating and criminally understudied chemical compound or pharmacological, drug here that could be used in what looks like an incredible number of options for treating various mental health problems, certain cognitive problems, dysfunctions like ADHD, Parkinson's, age-related mood disorders. So it really does seem that when it comes to the benefits, and we've long known about the mental acuity that comes along with nicotine as a fairly mild stimulant, kind of like caffeine, where you're kind of wakes you up a little more, you have more focus and attention. And that's one of the reasons people in the military have very long used nicotine, unfortunately, through smoking. And with studies like Dr. Newhouse's The Mind Study, we're learning much more about the mood regulation aspect that nicotine provides for people. So this comes into play with, age-related mental declines and schizophrenia and ADHD, for example. And it's one of the reasons that you see, it seems to be one of the reasons that you see really high rates of smoking in these groups of people. We're talking about 60, 80% sometimes, particularly if you look at people with schizophrenia, that's about 80% of the population there is smoking, which is bad. That's not great, right? Because a lot of them are going to die from that particular habit. But it seems to be the nicotine that they're looking for as a kind of corrective mechanism for whatever dysfunction or lack of function is happening for their particular situation in their brain. And of course, there are always risks with everything, and that includes nicotine. It is a stimulant, like caffeine, as we mentioned. But there are cardiovascular impacts, like if you exercise, if you drink coffee, if you use nicotine or any other stimulant, there's going to be some kind of cardiovascular effect. So if you happen to be a person who has a cardiovascular issue, maybe you're prone to getting tachycardia, or like fast heartbeat or something like that, that is where you would have to think very carefully and talk to your physicians or your healthcare providers or whatever, do some research, but what the risks might be for you in your particular case. And then there's also, this is something people in tobacco control talk about with whenever, anybody tries to talk about the benefits of nicotine, they usually try and point to, well, it's just solving problems that nicotine caused, right? So it's just helping you get rid of the withdrawal symptoms that you are getting now because you've become dependent on nicotine. And I think, that's just meant to shut down any kind of conversation on the potential benefits, pharmacological benefits of nicotine that should be studied. But, if you have a mental health condition, particularly one related to mood, if you have depression or something like that, and you are using nicotine to deal with that or to help or to mitigate some of the effects of that mood disorder, and then you stop, or you have to stop, or you have to go, you choose to go off of nicotine, and then you need to be very aware that there could be, like if you're on antidepressants, you don't just stop antidepressants because it can push you in a very dangerous mental place. It could really downregulate your mood and put you at risk for suicidal thoughts, self harm, that kind of. So that's something to keep in mind if anybody believes that they're using nicotine to deal with any of these things, working with a physician about if you choose to taper down or cut off. So to work out a plan on that kind of thing. So like there's risks for everything. It seems like, we are still at the very beginning of understanding all of the different things that nicotine does in the brain and the body, but it does really seem to have profound effects on things like inflammation. All right, so that's where you'll see diseases like Crohn's disease, which is an autoimmune disease that affects the stomach, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, Tourette's, and Behçet's disease. I don't know if anybody's ever, there's a really interesting study. Behçet's disease is, they believe it's an autoimmune disorder. It causes really painful lesions on the inside of your lips and your mouth. And they did a very, very small study, and they took some patients who had active Behçet's lesions, and they gave them transdermal nicotine, so a nicotine patch, and it resolved the lesions in I think 4 out of 5 of the patients. The other one, the other patient, it didn't work for them because they kind of refused to use the patch. And people with Behçet's do also have a higher risk of smoking, or they are more likely to smoke than the general population. So it seems like whether or not they know it, people are using nicotine as sort of a self-medication or a method of self-care. And it would be very important for them to know that it isn't smoking that is giving them that, and that there is a safer way. If they want to continue reaping whatever benefits they believe they're getting, they can get those with nicotine from a non-combustible source, whether that's a patch, gums, or e-cigarettes, or whatever.
I think lots of very interesting points mentioned there. And I love the fact that you brought up Dr. Newhouse. So for anyone who's never heard of him, he's Dr. Paul Newhouse, who is a psychiatrist. He's actually professor of psychiatry now and director of the Center for Cognitive Medicine at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in the US. And he has done some really interesting studies, and he's probably one of the leaders in this field in terms of how nicotine can actually help prevent memory loss in older adults with mild cognitive impairment. And actually, he did a study, which we'll link below after this is uploaded, this recording, and he showed evidence of improvement across multiple cognitive tests for attention, memory, speed of processing, and also consistency of processing. And he actually quoted to say that nicotine is a fascinating drug with interesting properties. So if anyone who's never heard of him, I think, his research is definitely well worth a read. I've read his study, and we'll link that below. So I'm really glad you mentioned that. And also you mentioned mood disorders and the benefits of nicotine and mood disorders. And actually I was looking at one of the UK's leading mental health charities. I was looking at their website, and it's the Mental Health Foundation. And they actually write that adults with depression are twice as likely to smoke as adults without depression. And people with schizophrenia are 3 times more likely to smoke than other people, and actually tend to smoke more heavily. And we also know that nicotine, this is what they say, nicotine stimulates the release of dopamine in the brain. And we know that dopamine levels are actually low or very low in people with depression and other mood disorders. So there's a whole world out there of research that could take place that looks at the biochemistry of the brain, the effect on dopamine, how nicotine can potentially boost dopamine levels, which has a wide variety of applications across different mood disorders. So I think, you made the point very well there that there's a lot of research backing this information. And as you said, that, people that are trying to move away from smoking this, but still have those chemical benefits from nicotine, there are other products. You mentioned e-cigarettes, there's nicotine replacement therapy, heated tobacco products, and even snus that provide nicotine in a more safe way. And I think, like you said, the benefits on mental health without the damaging effects of smoking is evident. Ilna, would you have any comments or questions to elaborate on these points for Michelle? Or anything you want to say at all? Now would be a good time.
I was just having a look at like you said, Jess, the dopamine levels being boosted when you use nicotine, especially when you have depression, that boosts it more. It just kind of made me think of the recent FDA video, or it wasn't FDA, it was a video, just basically a PSA with the addiction. You know, if you're craving it, you're addicted. And just like the similarities between addiction and and help with people with depression, ADHD, and other mental health disorders, and how the correlation between addiction and dopamine can actually cause people to think that nicotine is bad, when in fact it's just the chemicals in your brain reacting to the stimuli.
Yeah. And I mean, this is, so I want to add, I just recently encountered this study, and I was very sad to see that it doesn't appear that anyone has really followed up on it yet, as far as I'm aware. But there was a study done in mice, so, you know, it's not a human body that they did this in, so that's something to keep in mind. However, what they found was that nicotine completely reversed something called hypofrontality, which is, it's sort of, I mean, for an easy way to put it would be to say kind of a lazy frontal cortex activity. And that hypofrontality is seen in people who are schizophrenic, as well as people who are in the like end stages of severe addiction. And so nicotine administration completely reversed that hypofrontality. So this isn't just, I mean, dopamine is one thing, but then that's a whole nother mechanism that's happening in the brain chemistry. And so that's, you know, obviously you have schizophrenia on one side, which this could explain, you know, along with dopamine, one of the reasons that nicotine seems to be helpful for people with disorders like schizophrenia. But on the other side, nicotine itself, you know, this drug that we've been told for so long by public health authorities, it's addictive, it's as addictive as heroin, might potentially have a role to play in the treatment of addiction, which to me is incredibly fascinating. And I would love to see more studies done on that. If, you know, as we understand what addiction looks like in the brain and what can change the way the brain looks, so that we can maybe help people who have a dependency on certain drugs, whether that's opioids or whatever. I mean, obviously, I can't imagine that nicotine would be helpful in treating a nicotine addiction. But, you know, like I said, the research is pretty new. There needs to be a lot more, especially in actual human beings. But that's what nicotine does. And I agree with Dr. Newhouse. And this is one of the reasons that I have become so fascinated with nicotine, is that it is truly fascinating and it does so much. And there is nowhere near the amount of research done on this chemical based on the wide variety of things that it appears to do. And that's when I was doing my research for the Global Forum on Nicotine, and I was looking at all the various, you know, tribal peoples around the world and their practices of, you know, traditional medicine. I was seeing tribes separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years using tobacco, using tobacco leaves or some kind of tincture made out of tobacco for the same purposes, which, you know, and so that to me says that there is something there, right? And that should be looked into. And then you can see that pharmaceutical companies are 100% doing this. They are becoming aware of the powerful effects of nicotine as a chemical and are starting to test it. I know, for example, I think Japan Tobacco actually holds a patent on a pediatric eczema cream. And, you know, you think, why does Japan Tobacco have a patent on a medicine like this? And I couldn't tell from the ingredients. It doesn't list the word nicotine anywhere. It might have some different kind of chemical formula name, but a lot of the tribes that I was looking at around the world, it was very common and long-standing practice to use some kind of poultice of tobacco leaves for children who had eczema. And that's PS, that's quite dangerous. I'm not recommending that for anybody, particularly on children, because you can absorb nicotine through the skin. So you can cause nicotine toxicity that way. But, you know, in studies, it does have an effect because eczema is an inflammatory disease, an autoimmune disorder. And nicotine does seem to have anti-inflammatory effects, which, you know, when we were going back to talk about some of the risks, this is one of the, you know, we know nicotine is not carcinogenic. It doesn't cause cancer. However, there's some research that indicates that if you already have cancer and you are using nicotine, because inflammation is honestly, it's the body's way of dealing with disease, of trying to treat things, of trying to address foreign bodies in your body. And so sorry, I just lost my train of thought for a second there. Where was I going?
About inflammation and cancer, people that have cancer, if they take nicotine.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes. So, you know, if you have cancer, you want some inflammation for the body to try and attack it, to try and kill the cancerous cells. And nicotine might, in some ways, not promote the spread of, but prevent your body from stopping the spread of a cancer that already exists. But that research is new. It's not clear how much that risk is, how much risk is involved there, but that is something to think about and should be researched, of course.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And actually, your point a bit earlier about the addiction research and how nicotine could potentially be used to treat addiction or drug addictions, etc. So that actually that brings me on nicely to my next question, which was in terms of the different areas of research. If you were to prioritize one or two different areas in the next 5 to 10 years, which you think would be the most impactful in terms of mental health and nicotine in this whole area, what do you think would be the most important or the most significant, or what would have the most impact for people?
Oh gosh, that's such a tough question because there's so many, because, this is my thinking. I'm not saying this is exactly the way it is, but over my career and my talking with people and researching, I've really come to the belief that addiction has shockingly little to do with the actual substance being used, right? That people don't start using, or I should say, people don't start abusing drugs because they are addicted to them. They start abusing drugs for other reasons, and that usually has a lot to do with their mental health, their physical circumstances, their environmental circumstances, what's happening around, their financial circumstances. Really, mental health is and should have always been at the forefront of the conversation about drug use and drug abuse in particular. Whereas, mental health issues are often the leading cause of substance abuse, really. And yes, what you choose to use if you're going to abuse drugs does have meaningful impacts. If you're going to use, let's say, fentanyl-laced opioids off the street versus abusing alcohol, which you can purchase legally at a store and kind of, have a pretty good guarantee that it's not adulterated with any kind of toxin. But no, yeah, I would really love to see more research. And particularly, I would love to see more research on the role of self-efficacy in mental health and addiction, and particularly with nicotine, because I think in our passion to communicate to the public the dangers of smoking and to encourage people not to take up smoking or to quit smoking and give them help to quit smoking, we have really stigmatized the smoker. And now we're doing the same to the nicotine use, the person who uses nicotine or the person who smokes. Should be very clear, we shouldn't call them users. They are people who also happen to use these substances. And that, from some of the research I've seen, particularly with already marginalized people, whether that's a person of color in America, someone who has low income, someone who has mental health stigma perhaps, they are, their mental relationship with smoking and drug use is very complex, and it's not the way we would think normally when it comes to stigma. Sometimes stigma actually, if you look at, for example, mothers of color who are smokers, and they ask them in interviews, in research, like, what do you think when you see statements like, you're harming your children with your smoking, or, you're going to die and you're a bad person. And they internalize this. They truly do feel that, but it only makes them want to smoke more because they feel worse about themselves. They feel they have less control. They feel like a worse person. And that's a mental health problem that I think the public health community, and there has been some discussion too, to the health community's credit, but I don't think enough people have really thoughtfully asked, how do we balance this interest in encouraging the public to take safer, to make safer choices, whether that's quit smoking or switch to a non-combustible? How do we do that and balance concerns with stigma? Because we know that when you put stigma on a person, all the negative consequences that can have for their health. And I just don't think that's been talked about enough, because we're so concerned about keeping kids away from smoking, getting adults to quit, that we're not thinking about how are these tactics affecting public health? Like, separate from how they are working in terms of getting people to quit smoking, what is the overall public health effect on mental health from these campaigns?
I think it becomes a lot like playing telephone, where information gets handed down by the government to different groups and organizations, and a lot of it is also religion based, where it doesn't fit into that religious group or that belief system, and it gets degraded to such a point where it does become the stigma, and children are then forced to hide the things that are stigmatized, and it becomes harder to talk about, and creates almost a generational gap of discussions that aren't being held because of opinions that are made from fact and are not deducted from evidence, and not made publicly available, because the biases of, translating that information make it very difficult for there to be a clear-cut answer to all of this.
Yeah, and we see that all the time in public health, where there is a complex answer to what seems like a simple question, and public health authorities generally choose to go with the simple answer because they don't want to confuse the public into making bad choices. For example, we say that, and this is not necessarily my super area of expertise, but we tell women who are pregnant in America anyway not to drink at all, or even if you think you're going to get pregnant, there's a chance you could become pregnant, you shouldn't drink any alcohol at any point in time, even while our public health authorities know that the risks of one glass of wine at dinner, if you're in a specific trimester, is basically not very risky. That is a complex message to communicate to the public that public health often doesn't want to do, because they're worried some people will hear that as permission to just go bananas and, drink an entire handle of whiskey or something like that, even though I have more faith in the public's ability to understand some of this technical information if communicated correctly. But, and I think, Ilna, you really hit on an important thing, and it's something I've been saying since the beginning of the panic over youth vaping, which is that, and this is true of every drug panic, which is that when you have that much attention on the issue and it is such a hot button topic, and you then start this campaign of stigma and this campaign of trying to force youth or any age group to behave a specific way, it results in people feeling, they recognize that this isn't the socially acceptable behavior or acceptable by my parents, so I'm going to hide it. And then they hide everything that went into the decision to use that drug, whether it's nicotine or something else, and then the effects in the aftermath, like when they actually maybe do have a problem with a substance use issue, and they want help. That is such a hurdle for a young person to then admit that to any adult, when they know the response they're going to get is, I told you, that's such a stupid choice, blah, blah, blah. And I know when I was younger, for example, I have a pretty severe case of ADHD, which is why I lost my train of thought earlier. I had a little bit of tiny little distraction. I completely lost my train of thought. But whenever that started, I born with it, started young. I didn't know I had ADHD until I was practically in my 20s, but I knew I wanted to smoke by the time I was 13. And I can't tell you why, if that had any connection to it, but I didn't start smoking until I was about 19 or 20, like right around the age where it was legal where I was living. And for me, and I don't smoke anymore, and yay, thanks to alternative non-combustible products. But for me, it has a fairly moderate, it's a way for me to take care of myself. If I feel I didn't get a lot of sleep, I'm particularly distracted, I'm having a hard time, it is an additive. It is a conjunctive therapy, you might call it, on top of the prescribed medications that I might take. And I think that's true of a lot of young people, right? So if a young person is having a mental health issue, or they are feeling stressed or stigmatized or marginalized or whatever it is, and they are going to turn to a drug, to a substance of any sort, and then they start using that substance, and then they don't want to tell their parents or any adult authority figures about it, those adult authority figures will never know what went into that. They won't even know those problems necessarily were existing that led their child or the youth in their care to pursue drug abuse, honestly, right? So like my parents, ADHD wasn't exactly a very commonly known thing when I was growing up, but I wasn't expressing to my parents what I was experiencing or why I was turning to different substances to try and self-medicate. So they never actually even knew. And it was until I was an adult and went to my own therapist that they kind of nailed it immediately. But yeah, so I think that communication, and whenever you have a moral panic around substance use or any kind of behavior, you are functionally guaranteeing that youth pursue that behavior and don't tell their parents about it and hide that behavior, which is, if we're talking about youth and mental health, that's one of the worst things, when someone feels cut off and isolated and they cannot talk to the people in their lives that they trust to find the support that they need. It's a cascade of really problematic things, just one on top of the other for youth. I think that's a great point, Ellen.
And actually, what you both said about, you mentioned governments and how it's interesting how governments in different countries are so inconsistent with their advice. So you mentioned, Michelle, about how when you're pregnant, governments say kind of any alcohol, and then that brings me into the UK, because in the UK, when you're pregnant, you're told by your doctor, actually 1 glass of wine a week is okay.
We're told the same in South Africa.
Exactly. And actually, my friend, talking about vaping and pregnancy, I'm not saying that people should take out vaping when they're pregnant, or that I recommend people taking low risk drugs or any kind of drug at all. But a friend of mine, she was addicted to smoking, and she was actually quite a heavy smoker. And then when she was pregnant, her midwife was the one that suggested she vaped instead of, because she's addicted to nicotine. She loves nicotine, and the midwife was the one that said, "Why don't you try vaping? We think it's safe enough in moderation." And then she took up vaping, and the baby was healthy, no problems, and she stuck to the guidelines. But it's just funny because in most countries that would never be even an option. But in Britain, you're allowed, very small amounts of alcohol, you're allowed small amounts of vaping, it's actually recommended as opposed to the alternative or the worst alternative. It's recognized it is a safer alternative, and there are other options. It's not just, quit or nothing,
It's quit or die, right? And that's really important,
Exactly.
giving people that option, because when you don't give them any option, you say it's either this or death, this or you lose your baby, this or
Exactly.
permanent disability for your unborn child, you're going to have some number of people will say, okay, I'm not doing anything for the next 9 months, nothing. But then some people are just like, I'm just going to keep on doing what I was doing, without knowing that there was something they could have done that would have been massively less risky, massively less harmful to themselves, to their unborn child. And in the United States, we do recommend transdermal nicotine patches for pregnant women who cannot quit while pregnant. So we do recognize that nicotine, while not risk-free, particularly during pregnancy, is still an option for women who would otherwise just continue to smoke, which is going to have such a much larger deleterious effects compared to non-combustible nicotine administration. That's also, P.S., easier to control your dosing. And I'm not saying that necessarily with vaping, but with the patch, with gum, you can really titrate yourself. You can really meter out how much nicotine you're getting, to know if maybe it's whatever your guidelines provided by your doctor, if this is the max you can have while pregnant, or during this period of your pregnancy. It's much simpler.
Yeah. I think that brings me on to actually my last question. So I know you changed your job quite recently, so you moved to a new organization. I'd love to know how that's going, and actually what you're currently working on at the moment, and how that relates to this topic.
Yeah, so after about 16 years, just shy of 16 years, I left the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which I love. I still have so many friends there, nothing but the best. And then I joined in July the Reason Foundation, which, as you mentioned, publishes Reason Magazine, which I've been reading for many years now. I was really excited. I have a lot of friends over there, people who are working on similar issues. I'm still working, obviously, on nicotine and the tobacco harm reduction issue, but I'm also getting to delve into topics that I've wanted to write about and research much more during the most recent part of my career, which is other types of drugs and substances, because I really see nicotine, obviously, and cigarettes and e-cigarettes are different than other types of drugs, but I really see in the public health conversation over these, the way they are treated by the public and by the public health community, I see very little difference between nicotine as a substance and other types of drugs that we've treated. When we say drugs like opioids or cannabis or psychedelics or whatever that is, I see them all as part of the same category of recreational substance use or self-care. I think all of these, including alcohol, these are all things that we do, and there will never be a study showing you the precise benefits that a person receives after they've had a bad day of work and they have a bottle of wine with a friend. But there are clearly benefits because we keep doing them. Like, we keep doing this. And some people are going to say, well, that's this other horrible thing caused you to try and dive into a bottle to deal with your problems. But until we as a society can figure out things like, poverty and racism and all the things that kind of drive people to self-soothe, those things aren't going away, and they are still helpful in this reality that we live in. So yeah, I'm looking forward to, I get to work with Guy Bentley, I get to work with Jacob Rich and a lot of other people at Reason on nicotine and drugs, and that's what I'm so far so good. Early days, but as you all would like to say, early days, but it's going great so far.
You genuinely seem really excited and happy to be in the role. So congratulations. I'm so pleased it's going so well. It sounds like it's really suited to you. Before we go, are there any last questions or comments you'd like to make? Anything from you, Ilna, as well?
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Go
Ilna.
for it, Michelle.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, unfortunately, the U.S. government isn't providing a whole lot of non-simplified advice and information to the public. So, I know you wanted to talk later maybe about where people can go to look up some of this information. I mean, you can obviously go to the scientific journals and see what research has been done, but if you're looking for a sort of warehouse, unfortunately, there really isn't one. You know, you are not going to find on a government website a list of potential benefits associated with nicotine use. You're just not going to find that. But, you know, there are people like Dr. Newhouse, you know, Vanderbilt University's website, where they describe the MIND study. And then there are people like Brad Radu, who've been, you know, he's been studying smokeless tobacco use for 30, 40 years now. And his personal website, which I think is called Tobacco Truth, is fantastic. And he's constantly posting updates about the research as well as the public health policy conversation. But yeah, I'd say, you know, search around, do your due diligence, make sure you look at the authors, where they're coming from, where their funding is, all of that. But, you know, it's out there if you want to look. And unfortunately, I think there should be just, you know, thousands and thousands of more studies on all the various aspects of nicotine, its benefits, its harms, all of that, which would be beneficial to the public. It's just not there yet. Hopefully, if we can get the stigma to kind of wane, now that we're sort of getting, at least in America, we're getting post the tobacco wars. You know, we're in a new era where almost no youth smoke at this point, very, very few. So I'm hoping that as that wanes and the stigma around nicotine wanes and our memories of the era of the 80s and the 90s of the anti-nicotine campaigns wanes, we will get more interest and hopefully more grant money for researching some of these benefits, which could be really valuable in medical care and psychological care.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned actually the resources, because I'll post all of those below here. So there's Brad, there's Dr. Newhouse, there's yourself, you know, your presentation, PFN. I think Mark Gunter's done some great work. So we'll post all of that below. And I really recommend anyone here to actually follow Michelle on Twitter. I'll post your Twitter page below after finish recording, because you do post regularly, you know, several times a day, pretty much every day, and you provide updates on the FDA, obviously the US situation. You provide your own opinions, which is great. So I really highly recommend people follow you. Actually, we follow you, we read your material, so it's great. It's really interesting, and it is really up-to-date information, so it's hot off the press. So thank you for that as well. It's a great source.
And I would also, I'll give a shout out to my colleague Guy Bentley. You know, follow him on Twitter too, because he's doing the same thing.
Okay.
Oh, and Amanda Wheeler as well. I mean, she will really give you from the industry perspective side. But, you know, if you want updated information on what's happening on the regulatory side, she is the person to follow on Twitter, because she is on this 24/7.
Completely agree. So I will post their Twitter pages below here as well, or Ilna will, one of us will. Great. Thank you so much. Is that everything? All points made?
I think so.
Great.
Yeah.
I really, really thank you so much